The French Revolution by William Blake. Read by Leon Stevens. Advertisement. The remaining books of this poem are finished and will be published in their order. Book the First. The dead brood over Europe. The cloud and vision descends over cheerful France. O cloud well appointed! Sick, sick, the prince on his couch, wreathed in dim and appalling mist, his strong hand outstretched, from his shoulder down the bone runs aching cold into the sceptre too heavy for mortal grasp, no more to be swayed by visible hand, nor in cruelty bruise the mild flourishing mountains. Sick the mountains, and all their vineyards weep in the eyes of the kingly mourner. Pale is the morning cloud in his visage. Rise, Necker! The ancient dawn calls us to awake from slumbers of 5,000 years. I awake, but my soul is in dreams. From my window I see the old mountains of France, like aged men, fading away. Troubled, leaning on Necker, descends the king to his chamber of council. Shady mountains in fear utter voices of thunder, the woods of France embosom the sound, clouds of wisdom prophetic reply, and roll over the palace roof heavy. 40 men, each conversing with woes in the infinite shadows of his soul, like our ancient fathers in regions of twilight, walk, gathering round the king. Again the loud voice of France cries to the morning prophesies to its clouds. For the commons convene in the hall of the nation. France shakes, and the heavens of France perplexed vibrate round each careful countenance. Darkness of old times around them utters loud despair, shadowing Paris. Her grey towers groan, and the Bastile trembles. In its terrible towers the governor stood, in dark fogs listening the horror. 1,000 his soldiers, old veterans of France, breathing red clouds of power and dominion, sudden seized with howlings, despair, and black night, he stalked like a lion from tower to tower. His howlings were heard in the Louvre. From court to court restless he dragged his strong limbs. From court to court cursed the fierce torment unquelled, howling and giving the dark command. In his soul stood the purple plague, tugging his iron manacles, and piercing through the 7 towers, dark and sickly, panting over the prisoners like a wolf gorged. And the den named Horror held a man chained hand and foot, round his neck an iron band, bound to the impregnable wall. In his soul was the serpent coiled round in his heart, hid from the light as in a cleft rock. And the man was confined for a writing prophetic. In the tower named Darkness was a man pinioned down to the stone floor, his strong bones scarce covered with sinews. The iron rings were forged smaller as the flesh decayed. A mask of iron on his face hid the lineaments of ancient kings, and the frown of the eternal lion was hid from the oppressed earth. In the tower named Bloody, a skeleton yellow remained in its chains on its couch of stone, once a man who refused to sign papers of abhorrence. The eternal worm crept in the skeleton. In the den named Religion, a loathsome sick woman bound down to a bed of straw. The 7 diseases of earth, like birds of prey, stood on the couch and fed on the body. She refused to be whore to the minister, and with a knife smote him. In the tower named Order, an old man whose white beard covered the stone floor like weeds on margin of the sea, shriveled up by heat of day and cold of night. His den was short and narrow as a grave dug for a child, with spiders' webs wove, and with slime of ancient sorrows covered, for snakes and scorpions are his companions, harmless they breathe his sorrowful breath. He, by conscience urged, in the city of Paris raised a pulpit, and taught wonders to darkened souls. In the den named Destiny a strong man sat, his feet and hands cut off, and his eyes blinded, round his middle a chain and a band fastened into the wall. Fancy gave to see an image of despair in his den, eternally rushing round like a man on his hands and knees, day and night without rest. He was friend to the favourite. In the 7th tower, named the Tower of God, was a man mad with chains loose, which he dragged up and down. Fed with hopes, year by year he pined for liberty, vain hopes. His reason decayed, and the world of attraction in his bosom centered, and the rushing of chaos overwhelmed his dark soul. He was confined for a letter of advice to the king, and his ravings in winds are heard over Versailles. But the den shook and trembled. The prisoners look up and essay to shout. They listen, then laugh in the dismal den, then are silent, and a light walks round the dark towers. For the commons convene in the hall of the nation, like spirits of fire in the beautiful porches of the sun, to plant beauty in the desert-craving abyss. They gleam on the anxious city. All children new-born first behold them. Tears are fled, and they nestle in earth-breathing bosoms. So the city of Paris, their wives and children, look up to the morning senate, and visions of sorrow leave pensive streets. But heavy-browed jealousies lower o'er the Louvre, and terrors of ancient kings descend from the gloom and wander through the palace, and weep round the king and his nobles. While loud thunders roll, troubling the dead, kings are sick throughout all the earth. The voice ceased, the nation sat, and the triple-forged fetters of times were unloosed. The voice ceased, the nation sat, but ancient darkness and trembling wander through the palace. As in day of havoc and routed battle, among thick shades of discontent, on the soul-skirting mountains of sorrow cold-waving, the nobles fold round the king, each stern visage locked up as with strong bands of iron, each strong limb bound down as with marble, in flames of red wrath burning, bound in astonishment a quarter of an hour. Then the king glowed. His nobles fold round like the sun of old time quenched in clouds. In their darkness the king stood, his heart flamed, and uttered a withering heat, and these words burst forth. The nerves of 5,000 years' ancestry tremble, shaking the heavens of France. Throbs of anguish beat on brazen war foreheads. They descend and look into their graves. I see through darkness, through clouds rolling round me, the spirits of ancient kings shivering over their bleached bones. Round them their counsellors look up from the dust, crying, "Hide from the living!" Our bands and our prisoners shout in the open field, "Hide in the nether earth! Hide in the bones! Sit obscured in the hollow skull!" Our flesh is corrupted, and we wear away. We are not numbered among the living. Let us hide in stones, among roots of trees. The prisoners have burst their dens. Let us hide! Let us hide in the dust, and plague and wrath and tempest shall cease. He ceased, silent pondering, his brows folded heavy, his forehead was in affliction like the central fire. From the window he saw his vast armies spread over the hills, breathing red fires from man to man, and from horse to horse. And his bosom expanded like starry heaven. He sat down. His nobles took their ancient seats. And the ancientest peer, Duke of Burgundy, rose from the monarch's right hand, red as wines from his mountains, and odour of war like a ripe vineyard rose from his garments, and the chamber became as a clouded sky. O'er the council he stretched his red limbs, clothed in flames of crimson, as a ripe vineyard stretches over sheaves of corn. The fierce duke hung over the council. Around him crowd, weeping in his burning robe, a bright cloud of infant souls. His words fall like purple autumn on the sheaves. Shall this marble-built heaven become a clay cottage, this earth an oak stool, and these mowers from the Atlantic mountains mow down all this great starry harvest of 6,000 years? And shall Necker, the hind of Geneva, stretch out his crooked sickle o'er fertile France, till our purple and crimson is faded to russet, and the kingdoms of earth bound in sheaves, and the ancient forests of chivalry hewn, and the joys of the combat burnt for fuel, till the power and dominion is rent from the pole, sword and sceptre from sun and moon, the law and gospel from fire and air, and eternal reason and science from the deep and the solid, and man lay his faded head down on the rock of eternity, where the eternal lion and eagle remain to devour? This to prevent, urged by cries in day and prophetic dreams hovering in night, to enrich the lean earth that craves, furrowed with ploughs, whose seed is departing from her, thy nobles have gathered thy starry hosts round this rebellious city, to rouse up the ancient forests of Europe with clarions of cloud-breathing war, to hear the horse neigh to the drum and the trumpet and war shout reply. Stretch the hand that beckons the eagles of heaven. They cry over Paris, and wait till Fayette point his finger to Versailles. The eagles of heaven must have their prey. The king leaned on his mountains, then lifted his head and looked on his armies that shone through heaven, tinging morning with beams of blood. Then turning to Burgundy troubled, Burgundy, thou wast born a lion. My soul is o'ergrown with distress for the nobles of France, and dark mists roll round me and blot the writing of God written in my bosom. Necker, rise, leave thy kingdom, thy life is surrounded with snares. We have called an assembly, but not to destroy. We have given gifts, not to the weak. I hear rushing of muskets, and brightening of swords, and visages reddening with war, frowning and looking up from brooding villages and every darkening city. Ancient wonders frown over the kingdom, and cries of women and babes are heard, and tempests of doubt roll around me, and fierce sorrows because of the nobles of France. Depart, answer not, for the tempest must fall as in years that are passed away. He ceased and burned silent. Red clouds roll round Necker. A weeping is heard o'er the palace. Like a dark cloud Necker paused, and like thunder on the just man's burial day he paused. Silent sit the winds, silent the meadows, while the husbandman and woman of weakness and bright children look after him into the grave, and water his clay with love, then turn toward pensive fields. So Necker paused, and his visage was covered with clouds. Dropping a tear, the old man left, and when he was gone out he set his face towards Geneva to flee. And the women and children of the city kneeled round him and kissed his garments and wept. He stood a short space in the street, then fled, and the whole city knew he was fled to Geneva, and the Senate heard it. But the nobles burned wrathful at Necker's departure, and wreathed their clouds and waters in dismal volumes. As risen from beneath, the Archbishop of Paris arose, in the rushing of scales and hissing of flames and rolling of sulphurous smoke. Hearken, monarch of France, to the terrors of heaven, and let thy soul drink of my counsel. Sleeping at midnight in my golden tower, the repose of the labors of men waved its solemn cloud over my head. I awoke, a cold hand passed over my limbs, and behold an aged form white as snow, hovering in mist, weeping in the uncertain light. Dim the form almost faded. Tears fell down the shady cheeks. At his feet many clothed in white robes, strewn in air censers and harps, silent they lay prostrated. Beneath, in the awful void, myriads descending and weeping their dismal winds, endless the shady train shivering descended from the gloom where the aged form wept. At length, trembling, the vision sighing, in a low voice like the voice of the grasshopper, whispered, My groaning is heard in the abbeys, and God so long worshipped departs as a lamp without oil. For a curse is heard hoarse through the land from a godless race descending to beasts. They look downward and labor and forget my holy law. The sound of prayer falls from lips of flesh, and the holy hymn from thickened tongues. For the bars of chaos are burst. Her millions prepare their fiery way through the orbed abode of the holy dead, to root up and pull down and remove. And nobles and clergy shall fall from before me, and my cloud and vision be no more. The mitre become black, the crown vanish, and the sceptre and ivory staff of the ruler wither among bones of death. They shall consume from the thistly field, and the sound of the bell, and the voice of the Sabbath, and singing of the holy choir is turned into songs of the harlot in day, and cries of the virgin in night. They shall drop at the plough and faint at the harrow, unredeemed, unconfessed, unpardoned, priest wrought in his surplice by the lawless lover, the holy beside the accursed, the king frowning in purple beside the grey ploughman, and their worms embraced together. The voice ceased. A groan shook my chamber. I slept, for the cloud of repose returned, but morning dawned heavy upon me. I rose to bring my prince heaven-uttered counsel. Hear my counsel, O king, and send forth thy generals. The command of heaven is upon thee. Then do thou command, O king, to shut up this assembly in their final home. Let thy soldiers possess this city of rebels that threaten to bathe their feet in the blood of nobility, trampling the heart and the head. Let the Bastile devour these rebellious seditious. Seal them up, O anointed, in everlasting chains. He sat down. A damp cold pervaded the nobles, and monsters of worlds unknown swam round them, watching to be delivered. When Ormond, whose chaos-born soul eternally wandering, a comet in swift-falling fire, pale entered the chamber, before the red council he stood, like a man that returns from hollow graves. All surrounded, alone through the army, a fear and a withering blight blown by the north. The Abbé de Seye from the nation's assembly. O princes and generals of France, unquestioned, unhindered, awestruck are the soldiers. A dark shadowy man in the form of King Henry IV walks before them in fires. The captains, like men bound in chains, stood still as he passed. He has come to the Louvre, O king, with a message to thee. The strong soldiers tremble, the horses their manes bow, and the guards of thy palace are fled. Uprose awful in his majestic beams Bourbon's strong duke. His proud sword from his thigh drawn he threw on the earth. The Duke of Bretagne and the Earl of Bourgogne rose inflamed, to and fro in the chamber like thunderclouds ready to burst. What damp all our fires, O spectre of Henry, said Bourbon, and rend the flames from the head of our king. Rise, monarch of France, command me, and I will lead this army of superstition at large, that the ardour of noble souls quenchless may yet burn in France, nor our soldiers be ploughed with the furrows of poverty. Then Orléans, generous as mountains, arose, and unfolded his robes, and put forth his benevolent hand, looking on the archbishop, who changed as pale as lead. Would have risen, but could not. His voice issued harsh, grating, instead of words, harsh hissing shook the chamber. He ceased abashed. Then Orléans spoke. All was silent. He breathed on them and said, O princes of fire, whose flames are for growth not consuming, fear not dreams, fear not visions, nor be you dismayed with sorrows which flee at the morning. Can the fires of nobility e'er be quenched, or the stars by a stormy night? Is the body diseased when the members are healthful? Can the man be bound in sorrow whose every function is filled with its fiery desire? Can the soul whose brain and heart cast their rivers in equal tides through the great paradise languish because the feet, hands, head, bosom, and parts of love follow their high-breathing joy? And can nobles be bound when the people are free, or God weep when his children are happy? Have you never seen Fayette's forehead, or Mirabeau's eyes, or the shoulders of Target, or Bailly the strong foot of France, or Clermont the terrible voice, and your robes still retain their own crimson? Mine never yet faded, for fire delights in its form. But go, merciless man, enter into the infinite labyrinth of another's brain ere thou measure the circle that he shall run. Go, thou cold recluse, into the fires of another's high-flaming rich bosom, and return unconsumed, and write laws. If thou canst not do this, doubt thy theories. Learn to consider all men as thy equals, thy brethren, and not as thy foot or thy hand, unless thou first fearest to hurt them. The monarch stood up. The strong duke his sword to its golden scabbard returned. The nobles sat round like clouds on the mountains when the storm is passing away. Let the nation's ambassador come among nobles like incense of the valley. Aumont went out and stood in the hollow porch, his ivory wand in his hand. A cold orb of disdain revolved round him and covered his soul with snows eternal. Great Henry's soul shuddered. A whirlwind and fire tore furious from his angry bosom. He, indignant, departed on horses of heaven. Then the Abbé de Seillet raised his feet on the steps of the Louvre. Like a voice of God following a storm, the Abbé followed the pale fires of Aumont into the chamber, as a father that bows to his son, whose rich fields inheriting spread their old glory. So the voice of the people bowed before the ancient seat of the kingdom and mountains to be renewed. Hear, O heavens of France, the voice of the people arising from valley and hill o'erclouded with power. Hear the voice of valleys, the voice of meek cities, mourning oppressed on village and field, till the village and field is a waste. For the husbandman weeps at blights of the fife, and blasting of trumpets consume the souls of mild France. The pale mother nourishes her child to the deadly slaughter. When the heavens were sealed with a stone, and the terrible sun closed in an orb, and the moon rent from the nations, and each star appointed for watchers of night, the millions of spirits immortal were bound in the ruins of sulphur heaven to wander enslaved, black, depressed in dark ignorance, kept in awe with the whip, to worship terrors bred from the blood of revenge and breath of desire in bestial forms. Or more terrible men, till the dawn of our peaceful morning, till dawn, till morning, till the breaking of clouds, and swelling of winds, and the universal voice, till man raise his darkened limbs out of the caves of night, his eyes and his heart expand. Where is space? Where, O sun, is thy dwelling? Where thy tent, O faint slumbrous moon? Then the valleys of France shall cry to the soldier, throw down thy sword and musket, and run and embrace the meek peasant. Here nobles shall hear and shall weep, and put off the red robe of terror, the crown of oppression, the shoes of contempt, and unbuckle the girdle of war from the desolate earth. Then the priest in his thunderous cloud shall weep, bending to earth, embracing the valleys, and putting his hand to the plough shall say, No more I curse thee, but now I will bless thee. No more in deadly black devour thy labor, nor lift up a cloud in thy heavens, O laborious plough, that the wild raging millions that wander in forests and howl in law-blasted wastes, strength maddened with slavery, honesty bound in the dens of superstition, may sing in the village, and shout in the harvest, and woo in pleasant gardens, their once savage loves, now beaming with knowledge, with gentle awe adorned. And the saw and the hammer, the chisel, the pencil, the pen, and the instruments of heavenly song sound in the wilds once forbidden, to teach the laborious ploughman and shepherd delivered from clouds of war, from pestilence, from night fear, from murder, from falling, from stifling, from hunger, from cold, from slander, discontent, and sloth, that walk in beasts and birds of night, driven back by the sandy desert like pestilent fog-round cities of men. And the happy earth sing in its course, the mild peaceable nations be opened to heaven, and men walk with their fathers in bliss. Then hear the first voice of the morning, Depart, O clouds of night, and no more return. Be withdrawn, cloudy war, troops of warriors depart, nor around our peaceable city breathe fires, but 10 miles from Paris let all be peace, nor a soldier be seen. He ended. The wind of contention arose, and the clouds cast their shadows. The princes, like the mountains of France, whose aged trees utter an awful voice, and their branches are shattered, till gradual a murmur is heard descending into the valley, like a voice in the vineyards of Burgundy when grapes are shaken on grass, like the low voice of the laboring man instead of the shout of joy. And the palace appeared like a cloud driven abroad. Blood ran down the ancient pillars, through the cloud a deep thunder. The Duke of Burgundy delivers the king's command. Seest thou yonder dark castle that moated around keeps this city of Paris in awe? Go command yonder tower, saying, Bastile, depart, and take thy shadowy course. Overstep the dark river, thou terrible tower, and get thee up into the country 10 miles. And thou black southern prison, move along the dusky road to Versailles. There frown on the gardens, and if it obey and depart, then the king will disband this war-breathing army. But if it refuse, let the nations assembly thence learn that this army of terrors, that prison of horrors, are the bands of the murmuring kingdom. Like the morning star arising above the black waves, when a shipwrecked soul sighs for morning, through the ranks, silent, walked the ambassador back to the nation's assembly, and told the unwelcome message. Silent they heard. Then a thunder rolled louder and louder, like pillars of ancient halls, and ruins of times remote they sat. Like a voice from the dim pillars, Mirabeau rose. The thunders subsided away. A rushing of wings around him was heard as he brightened, and cried out aloud, "Where is the general of the nation?" The walls re-echoed, "Where is the general of the nation?" Sudden as the bullet wrapped in his fire, when brazen cannons rage in the field, Fayette sprung from his seat, saying, "Ready!" Then bowing like clouds, man toward man, the assembly, like a council of ardors seated in clouds, bending over the cities of men, and over the armies of strife, where their children are marshalled together to battle, they murmuring divide, while the wind sleeps beneath, and the numbers are counted in silence, while they vote the removal of war, and the pestilence weighs his red wings in the sky. So Fayette stood silent among the assembly, and the votes were given, and the numbers numbered, and the vote was that Fayette should order the army to remove 10 miles from Paris. The aged sun rises appalled from dark mountains, and gleams a dusky beam on Fayette, but on the whole army a shadow, for the cloud on the eastern hills hovered, and stretched across the city, and across the army, and across the Louvre. Like a flame of fire he stood before dark ranks, and before expecting captains on pestilent vapors around him flow frequent spectres of religious men weeping in winds driven out of the abbeys. Their naked souls shiver in keen open air, driven out by the fiery cloud of Voltaire, and thunderous rocks of Rousseau. They dash like foam against the ridges of the army, uttering a faint feeble cry. Gleams of fire streak the heavens, and of sulphur the earth, from Fayette as he lifted his hand. But silent he stood, till all the officers rush round him like waves round the shore of France, in day of the British flag, when heavy cannons affright the coasts, and the peasant looks over the sea and wipes a tear. Over his head the soul of Voltaire shone fiery, and over the army Rousseau his white cloud unfolded, on souls of war-living terrors silent listening toward Fayette. His voice loud, inspired by liberty and by spirits of the dead, thus thundered, "The nation's assembly command that the army remove 10 miles from Paris, nor a soldier be seen in road or in field, till the nation command return." Rushing along iron ranks glittering, the officers each to his station depart, and the stern captain strokes his proud steed, and in front of his solid ranks waits the sound of trumpet. Captains of foot stand each by his cloudy drum. Then the drum beats, and the steely ranks move, and trumpets rejoice in the sky. Dark cavalry like clouds fraught with thunder ascend on the hills, and bright infantry, rank behind rank, to the soul-shaking drum and shrill fife along the roads glitter like fire. The noise of trampling, the wind of trumpets, smote the palace walls with a blast. Pale and cold sat the king in midst of his peers, and his noble heart sunk, and his pulses suspended their motion. A darkness crept over his eyelids, and chill cold sweat sat round his brows, faded in faint death. His peers pale like mountains of the dead, covered with dews of night, groaning, shaking forests and floods. The cold newt and snake and damp toad on the kingly foot crawl, or croak on the awful knee, shedding their slime. In folds of the robe the crowned adder builds and hisses from stony brows. Shaken the forests of France, sick the kings of the nations. and the bottoms of the world were opened, and the graves of archangels unsealed. The enormous dead lift up their pale fires and look over the rocky cliffs. A faint heat from their fires revived the cold Louvre. The frozen blood reflowed. Awful uprose the king, him the peers followed. They saw the courts of the palace forsaken, and Paris without a soldier, silent. For the noise was gone up and followed the army, and the Senate in peace sat beneath morning's beam.